So I'm gonna go ahead and turn over the mic to Helen.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm so glad to see everyone here today, and want to thank Aaron and the Hermosa Beach Historical Society for inviting me to talk today. And again, I'm just glad everyone made the drive out. I drove in from Whittier, and it was beautiful, beautiful drive. I'm Helen. I got this opportunity to explore the voices of the Department of Justice internment camps as part of my graduate school work at Cal State Fullerton. And so I just wanted to share that and also kind of start off with a little bit about me and how I got into it. Okay. Okay, so these are my grandparents. I'm Hakka, so I'm Japanese American and Chicana, and so these are my dad's parents. And on the left is my grandfather. That was taken probably in the 30s, right before the war, World War II. And on the right is my grandmother, and they met at Heart Mountain in Wyoming, and at the Heart Mountain concentration camp. And my grandfather was actually born in Gardena, and well, both of them, they're Kibes, so they're Nisei, they're second generation, and they were educated in Japan, and then they came back around their preteens or teens to the U.S. And so my grandmother was born in Yakima Valley in Washington, and so they met at Heart Mountain, and I knew this just from family history, but I didn't really understand what Heart Mountain was, or what place it had in their lives. They never talked about it. My grandfather died before I was born, and my grandmother, she would talk about it a little bit with me, but I was 8, so I didn't have that knowledge to really ask her a ton of questions as I would now. But next slide. And so this is my grandmother's side of the family, and on the left are her 2 older brothers, Kazuo and Makoto Kuwata, and on the right is her youngest sister, Ruby. She's in the center, and with her classmates. And she also, my grandmother had another sister, Nancy, who's the second youngest. Next slide. Oh. And so this is Heart Mountain, and it was all these. Well, the historical photographs were photographs that my grandfather took, and that I found out about later on. And so in 2011. Was the first Heart Mountain pilgrimage, and people had gone to Heart Mountain either on their own or in a different groups. But this was the first time that people were going to see. There's an interpretive center or a museum there at the site, and so that was the big. They got 1,000 people. And I had heard about it at that time because I was wow, that's really interesting. I was a senior in college. I was finishing up my English degree at UC Irvine, and a friend of mine who he was a 5th year when I was a freshman, and we had kept in touch. And so he was finishing his master's at Cambridge, and he came back and he's starting his PhD program on the East Coast. And he's like, Helen, what if we take a road trip across the country, because it was like his last hurrah, and it, before his like 7-year PhD program, and I was like, yeah, because I had just graduated, and I was like, let's do that. So, and I didn't really know what was waiting on the other in DC. Well, eventually I lived in DC, but I didn't really like know what I'd do once I got out there. But I was very curious. So, and he loved to, so the deal was he could go fly fishing, and we could go hiking and car camping and all that stuff. But like, I really wanted to go to the pilgrimage, the first Heart Mountain pilgrimage. So, that was definitely part of the road trip. And it's like, and so this photograph on the left is it's me, and I'm standing in front of a picture of the Heart Mountain Camera Club, and that's like a big like wall mural in the museum. And so we get to Cody, Wyoming, where the pilgrimage is happening, but the museum is actually in between Cody and then another town, Powell. And I get the Cody Tribune, and like it comes with like a little magazine, and I'm flipping through it, and I'm like, wait, isn't that picture is kind of printed at an angle, and I'm like, wait, that looks kind of like my grandfather, like what? So I call my dad, and he's taking care of his mom, and so I send him a picture of that, and he blows it up on the computer and sits her down and says, where's Papa? And she points at him at that, and he's third from the right, so he has a jacket, and you can't really see it, but he's smiling, and he's holding like a tripod, and all of those guys are part of the camera club, and it looks like they're in front of Heart Mountain, which kind of plateaus at the top. And so that's when I realized, wow, like Heart Mountain played a larger role than I had previously thought or known. And that kind of led into, and I didn't know he was like really into photography. And so I found the Heart Mountain photos of like, friends and grandmother, but then like photos before the war, like the 20s, and then like photos after the war when my grandparents got married in like 1948 when they settled down in Los Angeles. So there's a lot of those family photos, and then like my dad and uncles and stuff. So so that was like the first time where I was like, wow, this is like I know history is like there's real. It's very impactful. It's real people. People's lives, are affected, and so that was 2011 was the first time I went, and between 2011 and 2015, that's when I was living and working in DC, and eventually, like everyone that I had seen at the Heart Mountain pilgrimage, like the host and like the former incarcerees, I eventually met them when I began to work for the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. I was the assistant for the chair out there because she was living in DC. And so the middle picture is the first time that my parents went out to Heart Mountain, and my dad, and I was working the pilgrimage. So I asked my dad, like, well, how did you feel like going out there? And like, how did you, and I got him, afterwards, and he's like, well, everyone that I knew growing up and that my parents knew growing up, I felt like they were there with me. I thought that was really interesting. I tried to get him to go back, but he won't go back yet. So in 2017, I was also working with the foundation, still working with the foundation, but the picture on the right, that was my extended family, so like my cousins and my grandmother's brother's children. and my mom, and so we kind of had a family reunion. That was at the 2017 pilgrimage before I started graduate school. And so, like, in addition to finding out about my own family history, I was also really curious about and had heard about the Department of Justice camps. And that was, I had heard of that in like 2010. There was the Art of Gaman exhibition at the Renwick in DC, and they had a film screening of David Guterrson's Snow Falling on Cedars, and there's like a really powerful scene where the dad is just like taken away by the FBI and not seen on screen like ever again for the remainder of the movie. And I wondered like, well, what happened? And they mentioned like, oh, Montana, but it's like very vague. So I was like, well, I want to know more about that, and like I want to meet people who either had maybe they had been there, like they were there as children, or well, rather not at Fort Missoula, but at the Department of Justice camps as children, or children of former incarcerees. And so that was kind of like the progression of how I arrived at my graduate school project, which was finding people to talk to and interviewing them as part of Cal State Fullerton's master's program in history. And so, next slide. And so this is Cal State Fullerton. On the left, it's their center for, the Lawrence DeGraff Center for Oral Public History. They just got a new space. It's on the 6th floor of the Pollock Library. It's open to the public during the week. And they have over 6,000 oral histories, and many of them are, it's national but also regional. And so the picture on the left is kind of like a collage of their new facilities. The archives are the top two photographs. There's a reading room, there's conference rooms where students and any researchers can kind of get to know or look at or read the transcripts that are there. And I believe there are listening stations. So I believe, to double check, but there's definitely a reading room. And so this space opened up after I graduated in 2019. This space opened up in like 2021, I think. And it's beautiful, it's great. It's like the new house for the community and like really the state's oral histories. And so on the right-hand side are my committee members, Doctors Ben Kothra, Aitan Agangia, myself, and Dr. Natalie Fusakis, and then not pictured is Arthur Hansen. He was a former director of the center, and also like an honorary member of my committee, and he's done and helped establish the Japanese American Oral History Project there. And so they already have a lot of oral histories on Japanese American incarceration, and so I was happy to kind of add to or expand on what they have. Next slide. And so these are just some of my narrators. I was really interested in interviewing, I had to interview 6 to 8 folks, so I really went for 8 and wanted to get, Japanese American, German American, Italian American, and Japanese Peruvian or Japanese Latin American folks represented. And to find these people, find everybody was kind of an adventure in its own. And I had met, on the I met Satsuki and Larry there on the left and the middle through my work with Heart Mountain. Along the way, Heart Mountain had a all camps consortium where people from all the camps and all the organizations that have to do with Japanese American incarceration met in DC, and I helped organize that. So they both came, and they both talked either formally or informally about their experiences in the DOJ camps. Larry was born at Crystal City, and his family was at Crystal City, and his dad was at Santa Fe, and then he was transferred to Santa Fe, the DOJ camp. He was transferred to Crystal City, which was the family camp. And Satsuki, her family was at Topaz, and then they went to Thule, and then her father went to Bismarck, the Bismarck DOJ camp, and her mother was at Thule, and then they both eventually went to Crystal City. And Trudy, who's on the right, actually I met her in DC. My mom introduced us because my mom had gone to the textile museum and happened to meet Trudy. She was a docent there, and she was wearing, and it was during the Cherry Blossom Festival, and so she was wearing a bird pin that looked a lot like the bird pins that were on display at the Art Gaman exhibit, and seen and made by Japanese Americans who were in camp. And so she asked her, "Oh, where did you get that pin?" And she said, "Oh, well, like it was given. I don't know who gave it to me, but it was given to my mother, and she gave it to me." And so she took it off and she showed it on the back, on the flip side. It said Crystal City Camp, and it was pretty interesting. And so I met Trudy through my mom, and we had kept in touch. We met in DC, and then continued to keep in touch. And actually, she just emailed me yesterday. And so, yeah, we talk a lot, and eventually I'll come back to Trudy because we got to eventually go to the Crystal City pilgrimage in 2019 together. Next. And so I also met Ursula Potter and Rosemary Anderson, and Ursula's father was at Fort Missoula. He was German and they were living in Washington, like Eastern Washington, and then Rosemary's father was Italian and a merchant marine, and he was at Fort Missoula. And it's interesting because I eventually visited Fort Missoula like the summer of 2018. And Rosemary had visited like a couple months before I did, and so by the time I got there, we're talking to other staff members, and Ted Hughes, who was the archivist there, he's like, "Oh, you should get in touch with Rosemary because she was just here, and like, I shared a bunch of resources with her, and it turns out that her father, she grew up in Spokane, Washington, and her father." And some of the men that were also at Missoula, they all moved to Spokane together, and so they kind of continued to keep in contact with each other, and she knew them growing up, which was interesting. And then Ursula, I contacted the German American Internee Coalition, and that's German Americans and their descendants who were interned, and put a call out for, was there anyone German American who was at Fort Missoula or Crystal City or Santa Fe? And she wrote back and she said, "Yeah, I'd love to be interviewed." So I got to travel. I also did a lot of traveling for this, so I flew up to Seattle to interview her, and then I drove down to Arizona to interview Rosemary. And the previous folks who were on the other side, Satsuki and Larry, they live kind of close to each other, like in Oakland and Monterey. And then I flew out to DC to interview Trudy. Next slide. And then I also got to meet Electra van de Berg, and she's in Missoula, still lives in Missoula, and her father was also at Fort Missoula. And then I also got to meet, let me back up. The Fort Missoula folks, they had been in touch with her because she had done several, projects with the museum or had done public speaking at their events. And so they introduced me to her, and let's see, and then we have Libby Yamamoto and Blanca Katsura, who are Japanese Peruvian, and they were at Crystal City. And so I met them through Grace Shimizu, who's like in charge of the Japanese Latin American Committee for Redress. And she, initially I wanted to interview Grace, and she's like, you should interview the elders because they have less time than I do. And she thought Blanca and Libby's stories would be very compelling. And they were great. I interviewed them, they were the only ones I interviewed together, and so that's a very different dynamic than interviewing someone one-on-one. So they would always fill in like each other's stories and say like, yeah, remember this? And she's like, no, not quite. I remember it this way. And so they were a lot of fun. And also that was done, I did it at the Richmond Community Center. And so what's interesting, because like each interview is different, and usually most of the interviews were done at someone's home. So it's it's quiet. They're in a space they feel comfortable in, and they want to talk at length with you. And so I reserved the entire day just to basically have a really in-depth conversation and make sure that they get to say everything they want to say on the record. On the record, because that's really important. And I don't want to rush things. And usually, oral histories range from an hour to like 3 hours. And if it's a whole day thing, then it can be longer. Because you take breaks, you get tired, you go out to lunch, you give yourself a break, get to know them, and it's always good to establish that rapport beforehand, either like on the phone or like in person if you know them beforehand. But it's always nice, like during the interview, to just take your time and get to know them and give them the space to tell their story. And so that's what we did here at the community center. And on the recording, you can hear, since it's done in like the back office, the room immediately outside is like kind of like this size room, and it's a game room. So it's like pool and cards, and so you hear people like having a really great time out there, and while you're doing the interview. So you always have the different dynamics depending on where you do your interview. Next slide. And so, and that the interviews were like kind of done, I feel like in a year's time or so, give or take, because I needed to graduate. And so, but in between that time, I also got a chance to visit Fort Missoula. So like the top photos are the barracks. The left and center photos are the barracks, and the photo on the right is the hospital. And that's actually, the hospital is where Electra's father worked when he was at Fort Missoula. And then I also got to visit Crystal City. I went with my mom and Trudy because I just really wanted to visit the place. Like I wondered again, like kind of like with Heart Mountain, what was there? Like, you know, what's there now? And because Trudy had talked about, I remember this statue. Like I remember coming in into Crystal City and passing by the town that was there, and like I've seen this statue of Popeye. And then she talked about the spinach fields too, and she's like, where? And we were driving around. We're like, where is this statue? And we happened to see it in front of the library. So we had like jumped out and took a picture, and she was very pleased. And that's my mom on the left and Trudy's on the right. And on the very left photograph is part of what's there now. There's a monument there, but by Japanese Americans and Japanese Peruvian Latin Americans, and that's the foundation is original, but it's actually also on the site of Crystal City High School now. So that's there's like many like layers, and the high school will play another factor in the pilgrimage. But going back to this March 2019 trip, Trudy had also talked about seeing this "Welcome to Crystal City" sign, and she was also saying like, yeah, you know, I'd really want to see that sign. Like, where is it? Like, so we kept driving around and around, and we happened to like turn off into like a little picnic area, and like there was the sign. Like it was in a residential area. I don't know if that's the original sign, but she was very thrilled to see that one too. So it was really cool, and that had been the first time that she had been back since she and her family were released from camp in 1946. So that was like, you know, a long time coming.
Can you tell us where Crystal City is?
Oh, sure, it's in Texas.
Texas? Oh, no.
By San Antonio,
yeah.
South of San Antonio.
Okay.
And Fort Missoula's in Montana, and then in Missoula, Montana, and then Santa Fe is near, like outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, the camp itself. And I didn't get to go to Santa Fe, but one day I want to because there is a monument there too. And they should.
None here in California?
DOJ camps?
Yes. What about Manson? That's not it?
No, it's not. It's it was built by another agency, the War Relocation Authority Center. The War Relocation Authority was the federal agency that built and oversaw it. But yeah, it is part of, all these camps are connected though, because like families went somewhat to the DOJ camps, but not all families went. Like fewer families and people in general went to the DOJ camps. Yeah.
How was it determined where you were sent? Was it the city you lived in, like Los Angeles? My mother grew up in LA, and she said one morning she woke up and all her friends were gone. Literally, they're just like trucked away.
Yeah,
You have to watch it, you know?
Berkeley has a really good, well, I'm not quite sure how they figured out who went where, but UC Berkeley has in their collections, and they're digitized, they have these maps that show you the communities that were, they don't say what camp they were going to, but they're like the instructions to all persons, big like placards, and they map out like where, like in this area, you know, these people, Japanese Americans are gone, like from this, you know, this block to this block and this block to this block. It's really interesting because I found like where my grandfather was living before the war, like on Westmoreland in East Hollywood. And then even where I live in Whittier, like the Friendly Hills area, like that was a section that was blocked off, and like these people were going to camp. So and I didn't know there was even a Japanese American population in Whittier at the time. So it's another avenue to explore for me. Next slide. Oh yeah. Okay, so these, I was working on sound bites because I wanted to give you, not sound bites, but clips. I wanted to give you guys, these are clips from Trudy because these are her family photographs. And so what she's talking about is reflected in the photographs. Let's play the first one on the left.
Self-taught, lessons and everything. But both of my parents, we always used to have an accordion. He was self-taught. He never had lessons or anything. But both of my parents were musical. They could sing, and I have a photograph of him at the camp where he's playing the big bass drum. He participated in the band, and so he had some music in his life.
In his life, that was the end of the sentence. But that photograph, her father is playing the bass drum in the back, so he's here. And so that was really interesting to see. Can we play the second clip?
Oh, there was a big meeting room, and when the Germans used it, they called it Café Vaterland. I don't know what the Japanese called it when they used it, but there were plays, the school children performed, there were concerts. There were talented people, internees, who could put together maybe a string quartet or a little orchestra or perform a musical show. So there was entertainment, and they'd get together and play cards. And when the invitations came out to do that, it always specified if there was going to be something to drink, bring your own glass. And if you had to be seated, bring your own chair.
And so this photograph on the right is the big Crystal City bass drum, and the woman in the center was Trudy's piano teacher, Miss Haga. And that's the Café Vaterland, the community hall. And so that then brings us to the Crystal City pilgrimage. This was in 2019. What was going on? Let's see, 2019. I had graduated in May, and I think earlier that year I heard about the pilgrimage. And usually pilgrimages they're organized by nonprofits, or in this case, well, they are a nonprofit too. They organize these these pilgrimages, so you can come and visit, and they plan out programs and with speakers and visits to the site depending on where you go. And this was the first time that I knew of that they had done a pilgrimage like this, and so they only had so many spaces, and so I told Trudy about it, and she's like, I really want to apply, and I'm like, you should, maybe we should both apply and we can go together. and so because she had gone to Day of Remembrance events. Day of Remembrance is a date in February 19th, 1942, where President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and so every year it's that date is commemorated, so it just happened, the 81st anniversary, and it's DOR for short. And so when she was living in DC, she would go to like DOR programs at the Smithsonian, and she always wanted to get up and say, well, like, you know, I was there too. And so I think in a lot of ways she wanted to just like talk about what she's experienced, because she hadn't talked about it to anyone until like her 40s, you know, and she was not encouraged to talk about it by her parents, and until she was in her 40s, and she's like, you know, I told someone, they're like, oh yeah, that, and she's like, what do you mean that? Like I've been, you know, not saying anything for 40 years. And so I felt, I encouraged her to apply, just because I felt like it'd be really good for her to be around other people who had experienced what she had experienced as a child and had been at the same place, even though it was a separate camps within the camp. But the important part is just being at the site again with everybody and being able to talk about it openly. And so she applied, she got in, I applied, I got in. But then they reached out to her to be on the panel. And this is her, and she's on a panel with Libby, who's on the right, and then Hiroshi Shimizu, who's in the Tule Lake Committee, which was a WRA camp in Northern California. He's on her left, and then I forget that fellow's name next to Hiroshi, but the woman on the left was Grace Morizawa, and she's with the National Japanese American Historical Society in San Francisco, I believe, definitely Northern California. And Grace was moderating the panel, and everyone was talking about their collective experience. And Trudy was the only German American there, but she was fine with that. Like she once she got up there and like, you know, started to talk, I think that was really I think a big deal for her, a big and a good time, because like, you know, she's meeting not only people who were there, like other people like Libby and Hiroshi and everyone. She was also meeting descendants, so she could like directly, you know, interact. And as with Libby, I mean, I think Libby and Blanca, they were both on the committee, the organizing committee, and they're like in their 80s. So it's really great to see people who are still so passionate about getting the word out that this happened and wanting other people to be a part of it. And so this was like a 3-day pilgrimage. So this was like the opening ceremony. So the slide the picture on the left is everyone coming into the opening ceremony area, and that the area itself where that like low concrete wall used to be the swimming pool that the internees built there, including Trudy's father, like helped to do that. And so everyone there's people coming in, it's kind of hard to see, but there's people coming up the road, and then people that are already there and standing around, and those are people who are from the community of the town of Crystal City, and there were, you know, like city council members and community members, and they were just like there to welcome everyone back. You know? And that's really interesting, because I haven't really seen that a lot, but I haven't been to many pilgrimages outside of Heart Mountain. So it was really refreshing to see that. And then on the right are they honored everyone who had been in camp and had them sit on stage while the opening ceremonies were going on. So that's that photo. And then we went to lunch. And that was like a pretty great lunch. We went to, not just because the food was great, but they took us to, we did a tour of the high school grounds, and saw some of the buildings, the high school buildings were original buildings that were repurposed into school buildings. But when we got into the cafeteria area, you go in and you just see all these easels and all these like photographs and all these posters, and we're wondering like, who did this? Like, because it was kind of like magical, you know, like no one told us that there'd be like this, you know, exhibit, this community wide exhibit, and I'm pretty sure it was the townspeople who were there, and they organized photographs and they set it all up. So we ate in the cafeteria, and on the on the left hand side are people, you know, just milling about and looking at everything. And there was so much to take in. It's like I just want to stay here for like a day or two. But of course, you know, you can't. But it was really exciting to see that community involvement. And on the right-hand side is Blanca. She's being interviewed by NPR, and that article later came out like the following week or so after the pilgrimage. Next slide. And then they also had Kokoro Kara, like a performance by the students, which was really, really exciting to see. And they were really excited to learn about why everyone was there, you know, why everyone was coming together, and what happened there at the high school. Next slide. Oh, and they also, let's see, on the left-hand side is the ASB, like student body of Crystal City High School, and the superintendent and school administrators, and on the right is the Crystal City Pilgrimage Committee that organized the pilgrimage. And so the ASB, the students, they gave the organizers like a big, you know, basket of snacks and things like that, which is, you know, is like a thank you, both a thank you and a welcome, and it was kind of like the bridging of these two communities, because there were a lot of remarks that were made at the opening ceremony by people in the community and the city, and then more remarks made by the school staff and administration here. And so it was like this bridging of two communities, like welcoming everyone back, and they were really involved too. I think the Crystal City Committee worked with the school administration and city council members to put the whole pilgrimage together. So like there's a lot of coordination going on. So that was really, really great to see that, you know, that involvement. And then this is towards the end of the pilgrimage, where like Trudy and Blanca got to talk, and then informally, you know, and on the right side is me with Jekko. I didn't interview her, but her daughter spoke at the pilgrimage as part of the programming, and then Trudy, and then Blanca in the center, and then Libby sitting down with the ukulele. And it was just a great time for like everyone to meet everybody. I didn't think that like my narrators would get to meet each other, because they live so far away. Like, you know, Libby lives in Richmond, Blanca lives in Central California, and then Trudy lives in Virginia. So it's like a place where they can all meet and like share stories and experiences, and hopefully keep in touch for the next one. I hear they're planning a next one for this year. Trudy emailed me yesterday, so she's like, yeah, I'll let you know, and because I'm planning to go, and I'm going to tell her I'm planning to go too if I can get time off. And so, yeah, and this is the road goes ever on in terms of learning. But yeah, I just want to thank everyone here and for coming out and so, questions? Yes.
So we're here to support my friend who was supposed to be here,
Mhm.
and she's in the hospital, so she couldn't be here. But her parents were in the internment camps, and some of her relatives, got separated to different camps. And he was her father was a photographer there. Has many, many pictures. They also have some artwork that they made there, and it was heartwarming to see the different things they did to make it a pleasant, not pleasant, but make things more pleasant for themselves. And she's taught me a lot about the Japanese culture, and so we wanted to be here.
Oh, great. I'm so glad you could join. I hope she's okay, your friend. Yeah. Okay, good. Oh, is it her? Oh, yes.
Me?
Yes.
I'm wondering, when you interviewed these people, what was the emotional detritus from
It was,
the people who were interned?
it was a range. Some people, when they began, like Livia and Blanco, when they began to talk about, especially about their father being taken away, like not being able to say goodbye, and they were, culturally, they're like really warm. So like, Livia was really close to her dad, and so she would always like run up and wait for him after he got off work, and then just like run up and hug him. But the law enforcement, when I was in Peru, so like the law enforcement wouldn't let her do that, and like they just loaded him on a truck and like they're waving goodbye. And so she started not crying, but like her voice, kind of shook. So you could feel that, whether or not she was ready to do that, I'm not sure. But and then like Trudy, she was there were certain times when, there was a mix of, I guess across narratives, there was a mix of like, anger and not being allowed to talk about it, or like their parents would just say, no, like we're not, like, I'm not going to talk about it with you, like this is an off limits topic. And a mix of kind of like reminiscent of like being a child in camp, and like just kind of remembering the happier times, even like making friends or like going to school. It's a mix. You never know what you're going to get.
Is there a large, I wasn't aware there was such a large population of Japanese down in Peru, and then they did the same thing we did, they had internment camps?
In Peru?
Isn't that what you were saying, that she's lived in Peru? Did I misunderstand?
Oh, let me clarify. Yeah, she did live in Peru. And so the U.S. worked with like 8 different countries in Latin America to round up people who were thought to be, but weren't, saboteurs, and so they took the men, most of them men, and then by extension their families, because it was either the mothers, they stayed behind and tried to figure out what to do, or they wanted to keep their family together, and so they went to Crystal City. No, Europe.
So I think that's something I just learned this weekend, is that they were actually, it wasn't just American citizens or immigrants to America, it was people brought from other countries.
Yes.
were specific to the DOJ,
Yes. Yeah.
camps.
Yes. Oh, wait. Let's go first here, and then we'll go over here.
A friend of mine was a small child in the internment camp here in California.
Mhm.
And what impressed him, the guns pointed inward.
Yes, you hear a lot of different stories about that. Well, a lot of different, like when you talk to different people, you know, they notice, that's one of the first things they notice, where the gun's pointing inward. Norm mentions that as well. Yeah, it's very interesting that was going on. Hang on, let's go over here first and then over here. Go ahead.
I just was curious about numbers, if you have a general idea, how many Americans were sent to the DOJ camps and how many of the, I forget, did you say DOR for the other, like, camp?
The other, so the War Relocation Authority camps, there were over 120,000 Japanese Americans and their families were in those camps. So that's like Tule Lake, 10 camps, like Heart Mountain, Topaz, Manzanar, Jerome, Roar, Amachi, thank you. Manzanar. And Tule Lake, let's see, and Poston, Arizona. Yeah, there were 10 camps in 7 states with those camps. The DOJ camps, there were eight camps in 4 states. I'm not sure about the numbers in terms of Americans, usually American children, like Satsuki, like Larry, like Trudy, who were in camp. But that's another research avenue to look into, because there are varying sources on numbers, and it'd be good to research that some more.
And what, one last question is just what was the difference of those 2 types of camps, the DOJ versus the other?
The DOJ camps were internment camps, so they incarcerated men who were at war with the U.S., but they were citizens of that warring country, so like Japanese citizens, German citizens, Italian citizens, and the WWII camps were incarcerated Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans and their families. So like families meaning like their parents who were first generation called Issei, but they couldn't become citizens by law, and so they were Japanese citizens because they couldn't become American citizens. I believe.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you. It's very informative. I was aware of the Japanese Americans being put in camps, but I was not aware of German Americans and Italian Americans, and
Yeah.
Peruvian.
Yeah.
It appalls me what fear does.
Yeah, I have a friend he's like a couple years younger than me, but I think his family was Peruvian, and his grandparents, and then his father's family lived in Mexico. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I also heard that at one point if you joined the service, there was different, like if you had a member of the service, there were different rules about whether you went to the camp or whether you could come out of the camp. Was there anything like that?
I'm not sure. I have to look into that, but that's a good avenue to look into. Yes. I will look
This
into
is
that.
my friend David.
Hi, David.
And he shared that with a group of us at one point in time, and his experience. David, do you want to say anything about it?
You don't have to. But
I
always.
recently wrote a book about my photographs and some stains. And one of the things that I mentioned was that right after the war, I was born in one of the camps. I was born in Colorado, Amachi.
Amachi, okay.
But after the war, and we were sent back to our communities, my parents almost never talked about how awful the camp experience was. I think one of the reasons they didn't talk about it was to not turn us, the children, my generation, against America, against Americans. So at first, I was very ashamed of being Japanese because I faced a lot of prejudice. In high school once, teachers said, you know, your people killed my father. So for the longest time, I was not very proud to be Japanese American. But because my parents didn't talk about how awful the country treated them, I grew to appreciate America. And I'm a proud American. In fact, in my book, it's one of my chapters about being a proud American. And so I think in many ways what our parents didn't talk about was a service to us. So I'm very proud today to be a U.S. citizen, and I appreciate what you're doing and the research and what you're calling attention to, because I think more of us need to know that.
Thank you. What's the name of your book?
Images and Reflections.
Okay.
American-born citizens were thrown into camps too. In Matt, so his parents were born in Japan. Were your parents citizens when they were sent to the camps?
No, both my parents were born in this country.
Okay, so they were Americans.
Yes.
And they were interned.
Yes.
A blot on this country.
Yeah. A lot. We're not talking about any emotional toll.
Yeah.
Must take on these people.
And I might add that, one of the reasons the Japanese on the West Coast were interned in camps was the fear of sabotage and espionage. There was not one example of a Japanese person who was a spy, who did anything at all to aid the Japanese in the war against America. Not one.
And what was it, the Japanese-American battalion that fought in Spain? All the young Japanese fought in the U.S. Army in mountains in Italy, excuse me.
You're right, the 442nd is
And they were one of the
decorated.
most decorated outfits,
Yes.
too. It was unbelievable because they didn't intern anybody, any Japanese Americans, in Hawaii because there were too many of them. They couldn't make it. No, there were too many lived there. They couldn't do anything with it. And they had no problems there at all either. The reasoning was incredible.
Reasoning was
So,
awesome.
Yeah.
I thought what was also interesting, you might have mentioned this earlier, but you kind of glossed over from the first time you went to Heart Mountain, and then next thing you know, you were working for the foundation. So was that would seem like in that progression? Did you touch on that earlier? Or did
Oh, no, I didn't touch on how that came to be.
But it seems like a real interesting. I mean, that might be a story for another day. But there was obviously a connection from that first visit that you took. Right?
Yeah, there definitely was. So like going into the first 2011, going into the first pilgrimage, I'd see everyone listen to the programming, see former incarcerees being honored, and like they did the ribbon. Former incarcerees and like board members, they cut the ribbon for the to open up the museum for the first time to the public, and that was that was exciting, so exciting. But I didn't think that years later I would be working with the very same people that were organizing and running the center. And so that came to be because I graduated college. I was living with my mom. I was interning at various places, like there's Washington Life magazine, like a fashion magazine, National Endowment for Humanities. So interning a lot, and I finally got a paid internship with Education Week, which is a K-12 newspaper. That's a national K-12 newspaper, and at the time I started writing. Well, I started looking into my grandfather's photographs, and what was interesting is that I found I found his photos, and one of them, well, two of them were of my grandparents. And I also found my grandmother's. She did sewing in camp, and I didn't know that. And so she knew I like to sew, and she would give me fabric every single time I'd go over to her house. And so I was over at her house, and she gave me something, and then I noticed in the corner there's this little red binder, and I was like, well, what's that? And so I grab it, and it's all these sketches that she did happen to do in camp, and they're miniature, 8.5 by 11 sketches. And then I also find out that there's these typewritten instructions, so from the class, and it says the teacher and what they're working on, and because I'm self-taught, so I didn't have the formal training to know the terms of sewing and drafting, pattern drafting, but I still thought that was pretty interesting, and so I pitched that story about well, I know that she was sewing in camp, so maybe those classes that she took in camp helped her later on, because she was a seamstress after the war in LA, and she did piecework, and so I pitched it to the Atlantic, and I did it on a Tuesday, and I heard back on a Friday. And they're like, yes, we want that story. I'm like, okay, so I started writing it, and they're like, when can you send it? I'm like, how about a month from now? They're like, yeah, that's fine. So I'm furiously writing, and that really helped. It was both a way to research her, one aspect of her experience, but also kind of dig into my grandfather's photographs, because I included some of the photographs in that article. And I was interning for Education Week, and so when their executive assistant, Heart Mountain's executive assistant, she was moving on to another position, they thought of me, and I had connected with the chair and her assistant previously, because I wanted them, I just wanted to show them these photos that my grandfather had, and also at the time I also found a big painting of the camp at night, and I wanted to just show her the pictures, and that was it. It wasn't to try and get a job. It wasn't to. I didn't really think that connection would go as far as it did, but I was interested in getting to know the people. She was the only person I knew at that time that was working in the pilgrimage and the Heart Mountain community, and so I wanted to find a way to volunteer or be involved somehow, because I didn't know what I wanted to do for my career yet, but I knew I wanted to write, and so that's kind of how that came about.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say it's so great that you have the interest in sharing this information, and also that you wrote a book and are sharing information. And I think in every town across America, there are so many important stories about people that were unfairly interned, and even locally, I found out that the high school where our kids go to here in Manhattan Beach had previously been owned by someone who owned a nursery, and they were forced to be interned, and when they came back, their land was gone, and that just is, I think, true all over the United States, and I think it's just really important that these stories are shared, and thank you.
Thank you, yes. Yes.
Have you published, I'm sorry, have you published those pictures that you have?
Some of them, in different articles.
The Atlantic article, you have that with two names, sewing, and then the other one of the nighttime.
Actually, yeah, that was published, well, it's not the painting, but it's a similar painting, and that's on Cal State Fullerton's, they have a digital magazine called Titan Magazine. Yeah, but because that artist did multiple like similar paintings, and so they had asked the foundation about it, and the foundation gave them a photograph of the painting to use in the article.
And is the Fullerton exhibit open to the public?
It is on the weekday, actually separately. There is, I don't know if it's still there, but I had worked with Craig Hara, who's an emeritus professor at Cal State Fullerton in philosophy. He was born in Rohr, the Rohr concentration camp in Arkansas during the war, and he wanted to do an exhibit on his family, and that is, I believe it's still there. I have to check, but I think that's at the Center for Oral and Public History. It's like in a display case, kind of like that. Yeah. Yes. Wait. Go ahead.
Since, this kind of information is so hard to come by if you're not in the milieu, thank you so much for what you're contributing. Now, in our case, our friend who can't be here today, is there anything that we could suggest to her if she wants to show photos or things that her family might have, if that's a story that connects to other stories?
Yeah, like if she's looking to get them published or looking for resources.
I have no idea, but she has these lovely objects that maybe if we come back to her and say, well, here's an avenue possibly, if she's so interested.
Yeah, JANM is Japanese American National Museum. That's an avenue. Densho, they are an online archive that specifically addresses or talks about the Japanese American incarceration experience in the 10 camps. There's also the Cal State Japanese American Digitization Project, which is where all the Cal States work together to digitize their collections about Japanese American incarceration history. And they have a website, but I don't know if they're taking donations, but that's another avenue. Trying to think of others. Yeah.
Well, that's certainly a good start.
Helen, did you have one?
Yeah,
There's one more question.
Okay. Go ahead, Dave. Yeah.
I wanted to thank this group here for having this program, because I think a lot of times these stories are never told, they're never heard. And there are many, many Caucasian Americans that were supportive of the Japanese. They held their properties, they held their markets, they held their farms, so that they weren't confiscated by others. So I think most Americans really care about others, and I commend this organization for what you're doing and for having our speaker today.
David, can you say the name of your book again, please?
Images and Reflections.
What's your last name?
Kuroda, K-U-R-O-D-A.
All right, well, thank you so much everyone for coming, and again, thank you Helen for all of your wonderful work, and yeah, we hope that you enjoyed it.